way of Will John.
Guys, what's going on? We are back with a very special guest, Vicky Ward. Is it cool if I say your full name? Can I say your full name? It's pretty cool.
Of course.
Okay, cool. I mean, I don't. Some people call me Will John. I actually like my full name, which is William Oluremi John. So Victoria Penelope Jane Ward. A British-born American author, investigative journalist, editor-at-large, and television commentator. She was a senior reporter at CNN and a former magazine and newspaper editor who has been featured in the New York Times bestseller list. Vicky, thank you for being here. How's it going?
Thanks very much for having me. Now, do I call you Will or William after that?
No, you can call me Will.
Okay.
It's fine. Yeah.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah.
I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. So like I said before we were on air here, I have been doing a very deep dive into all the things that you have. I guess not all of the things because you've been a journalist for some time now, but so many fascinating subjects. Given what we have today, I thought we're going to talk a little bit about Ukraine. I read an article that you wrote or you summarized a conversation that you had on the Ukraine-Russia war. Now it's no longer just a crisis, it's a war. And then obviously you have successfully uncovered, I should say, a whole lot on the Epstein Ghislaine Maxwell saga. And so the idea is that we can get, into both of those. But before we get into that, why don't you just let us know, obviously you read your intro and everything, what kind of drove you to be the journalist that you are today? I'm just personally curious how you got to be this.
Well, so I've always loved reading and writing. I was an English lit major at Cambridge University in England. But to be honest, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And at the time that I was graduating, believe it or not, investment banking was the cool thing. So it feels weird saying that now. This is 30 years ago. All my friends wanted to be investment bankers. And what I realized, my father was an investment banker. But what I realized when I applied to all these different banks, which my dad told me was a really stupid idea, was that I would have been a terrible investment banker. And I then thought, well, maybe I wanted to be a lawyer. And my father said, you know what, you're just procrastinating. So I'm certainly not going to help you financially with law school because I think that, you're just putting off the inevitable. And he said, you always like to write, so why don't you just go and do it? And, it's one thing to say that, another thing to then make a living and a career out of it. But what I did find was that on top of really loving to write and to read and to learn is that I'm a very social person and I'm a very curious person. And I think that the combination of all of that makes you a very good reporter because you sort of need to, I think, to be a really good journalist, you need to believe that everybody you meet has a really interesting story to tell. And in some cases, many cases, they don't know what that story is. And the job of a really good reporter is to listen and to find a way to get it out of them. And I think that I was very lucky in some ways to train in England, which is where I grew up, before coming to the States. In my late 20s, because the way that the British train their journalists is, that they hire quite a few graduates. They don't give them jobs. They deliberately sort of pay them freelance retainer, and it's like a competition. They send you out at night, and they can send you to Westminster, to the Houses of Parliament. They could send you to a book party. They could send you to a theatre opening. But you have to come back with a story and put it in the paper the next day. And that you're up against all these other people who are in different places, all doing the same thing. What it teaches you to do, frankly, is walk into a room full of strangers and find a story. And that is much harder than covering a train crash or something like that, because it just asks more of you. And I think that I was very lucky. I ended up with a great mentor in England. I've been very lucky. I've had Tina Brown, a legend in the media industry, who's been a great mentor to me this side of the Atlantic. So I think, the combination of, I really, I am this curious person who always wants to learn. I like talking to people. I like learning what their story is. I like them telling the story. I think the combination of all of that, plus being blessed with some great mentors, has kind of made me who I am today.
Sure. Yeah, I find that part really interesting, because that is a skill, to be able to walk up to someone and to pull it out. The part that struck me is the fact that some people don't know their own story, which is so true. People tell themselves that we talk to ourselves, we are telling ourselves a story. But it reminds me of a friend of mine who really wasn't doing much, but I haven't seen this guy for quite some time, but he had a coin collection, which on the surface sounds pretty boring, right? But then if you kind of discovered more, you'd see that he had coins that you weren't supposed to have. He had Nazi coins that he had somehow coming on. And there's a story there. Like,
Yes.
What is this? How did you get that? Where do these come from? And, and it's like, no, you don't really have something so boring. Yeah, coin collection on its surface is boring, but if you can figure out how to dig the dirt out of it, then it is. And speaking of that, it just was really, really interesting. So I read the transcripts, and I know I said I wouldn't start on this, so I don't want to get too derailed. But I did read the transcripts of the conversations you had with Ghislaine Maxwell in 2002, I believe, when you were still working at Vanity Fair.
Yeah.
And that was surreal. As that conversation struck me as more surreal than the Epstein transcripts, just due to the trying to see how you were trying to display and how you're trying to come across, and at the same time trying to pull it. It was incredibly fascinating. So I guarantee you guys we will get to that in just a second. But why don't you then just give us a good basis? Most everybody here has heard of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. If you haven't, welcome to a very, very strange story. But you have done a documentary. You've got a podcast series. You've written a number of articles, of which I've read. So you must be one of the few experts on a subject that's very hard to research and very hard to get a whole lot of information, even for somebody like you. The general public is trying to understand this story, and that's why it's captured everybody. The general consensus for most people who are just commonly thinking it, Epstein didn't kill himself. That's no one wants to believe that someone of that stature in nature could just kill himself. I guess obviously, as a journalist, you have to look at all options there. But what do you understand of the entire Epstein saga? What do you make of it? What could you, if for someone who's just coming on to this, what could you kind of give them as a synopsis of a story of a guy that we don't really know who he is? And I don't know if you have any answers to that.
So the story of Jeffrey Epstein is, on one level, very simple, and on another level, an extraordinarily complicated mystery that 2.5 years after his mysterious death goes on. And so the simple narrative is that he was a sick man who had a perversion where he liked having sexualized massages with underage girls, and that he preyed on these particularly vulnerable girls who would do it, who he would pay, and he got some of them to go and recruit other underage girls. Ghislaine Maxwell was the daughter of a very wealthy publishing magnate who also was a crook, who died in very strange circumstances himself in 1991, which meant that when she met Jeffrey Epstein, she would have been in her 20s at the time. She had gone from being a very rich heiress who knew many, many important, powerful people around the world to having no money. And so she stands currently convicted of being essentially Jeffrey Epstein's madam, as someone who, according to prosecutors, was paid $30 million by Jeffrey Epstein, stood by him through over 10 years, even though Jeffrey Epstein didn't particularly treat her very well, to procure these young girls for him. And the picture that was presented during her trial by government prosecutors was that she did this in order to finance the lifestyle that she was used to. Now, that is the very nasty, simple story. And Jeffrey Epstein went to jail once in 2009 on two state charges of prostitution and in one case underage prostitution, soliciting an underage prostitution. It turned out many, many years later he was rearrested. There had been a federal investigation that involved many, many more girls that had been hushed up sort of at the time. And when he was rearrested and put in jail in 2019, this was for a much more the serious offences of running a sex trafficking ring with these underage girls. He never got to stand trial for those crimes because he died in jail, reportedly, according to the coroner, a suicide, and yet the circumstances were very, very odd. He was detained in what is supposed to be the most secure prison facility in America. And yet the night that he died, the cameras weren't working. The guards were not there. and I don't even think that it's questionable as to whether he should have been in solitary confinement, given that only days earlier he had been declared a suicide risk. So there are many problems hanging over, many questions hanging over his death. But so the story of the sex is relatively simple. What's more complicated is who was Jeffrey Epstein when he wasn't having sexualized massages with underage girls? And that obviously is very, very important because Jeffrey Epstein got very, very rich very suddenly. He went from somebody who had a one-bedroom apartment in New York in the 1980s to, by the mid-1990s, he had a plane, he had the biggest townhouse in Manhattan, he had an island in the Caribbean, he had a massive ranch in New Mexico. And he went from being, in the 1980s, he's someone who had been in finance, left Bear Stearns, then an investment bank under slightly murky circumstances. But he suddenly reinvented himself as this sort of Great Gatsby figure who had all this money. And it's during this period, during the 1990s, when he meets Ghislaine Maxwell right after or around the time that her father dies and she's penniless and wants money. But it's around this time that he starts, as far as anyone knows, abusing underage girls. This was not something he was known to have done prior to amassing all this wealth and these enormous Shangri-Las. And so what nobody to this day really fully has been able to piece together is where, I mean, we know bits of it, is where all this money came from. And secondly, why did Jeffrey Epstein, this mysterious financier, attract all these really powerful men to his houses? Why did they all want to go for rides on his planes? Now, and when I say men, I'm talking, everyone. He was at one point friends with Donald Trump. They fell out. He was at one point very close to Bill Clinton. He had all these Nobel Prize scientists visiting him. Bill Gates has been associated with him. The financier Leon Black has been associated with him. Leslie Wexner said that he was at one point Epstein's biggest client, and then Wexner has said he since discovered that Epstein stole from him. I mean, the list. Prince Andrew, most recently, has had to settle a civil dispute with a woman who claims that Epstein pimped her out to him. He's, the settlement means that she's no longer making that allegation. He's no longer talking about her. Certainly not admitting to that allegation. But it's sort of like 2.5 years after Jeffrey Epstein's death, the list of prominent, powerful men who are either losing their jobs, like Jess Staley, who did run until very recently Barclays Bank in England, had to step down from his job. What on earth were all these guys doing floating around Jeffrey Epstein? And it would be the obvious answer is girls, but it isn't just girls. It's clearly something to do with money. We know that Leon Black, who had to step down from running Apollo, one of the biggest private equity firms in the world, did so after an independent investigation found that he had paid Jeffrey Epstein $160 million for tax advice. I mean, that's an extraordinary amount of money to pay. There are law firms that are set up just to give people like Leon Black tax advice, and yet Leon Black went to see a guy who had worked for an investment bank once for 7 years and paid him $160 million for tax advice. That is just unbelievable. Bill Gates has said that he went to see Jeffrey Epstein because he believed that Jeffrey Epstein could help him scale his idea. He wanted, Bill Gates has this giving pledge where he wants all the billionaires in the world to pledge to give their money away. And he believed that Jeffrey Epstein was the person who could really help him implement this. Again,
So you don't buy that?
There was clearly something about Jeffrey Epstein. Well, it's not that I don't buy it. It was that there was something. Jeffrey Epstein clearly understood how power works. He clearly understood how to manipulate people. And then there is this added dimension where he was clearly very close to the Israelis. We know that Ehud Barak, former Israeli prime minister, was often with him. He was also very close to the Saudi crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. There was a photograph of him in his house. And he used to tell a lot of people that he was advising various African dictators. And remember, he had a home in Paris. And so there's been a lot of questions raised by ex-Mossad people that, was he it seems very clear that he was part of an Israeli influence campaign, but was he also what is known in the intelligence world as a hyperfixer, hyperconnector? These
Okay.
are people who are very rare, who can move between very different cultures, and communicate between, are used as a link so that these different cultures talk to each other. And
See.
what's interesting is that Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, was well known. He was part of the Israeli intelligence network, and he is buried. He was given a hero's burial in the Mount of Olives,
Mm.
and he controlled most of Israel's economy at the time of his death. And he moved in, unlike Jeffrey Epstein, he moved in plain sight as this huge publisher, published scientific journals. And so each country that he was involved with, whether it's America, Britain, Bulgaria, Russia, Israel, were all interested to see what each country's different scientists were working on. But there's, Robert Maxwell was, spy would not be the right word, but he was bringing intelligence to everybody, but everybody knows that. So the question is, was there more to the friendship between Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein than just this horrible
Right.
sex crimes? I mean, so the fact that we still don't know where Epstein's money came from, we still don't know which plutocrat we're going to read about next. Who's, the list keeps on growing, and it's it's bewildering, because I think it really tells you that there is, in a way, a hidden world of power. We tend to think that power lies in governments, or it lies in capitalists. But it would seem, from the drips and drabs of information that we're learning about Jeffrey Epstein, that there's almost an invisible layer of power that is conducted, that sort of major world events and get conducted in private rooms in big houses, and that most of us have absolutely no idea about the manifestations of this and who the real players are. And I think that is the mystery of Jeffrey Epstein.
Okay. Well, so by the way, that's a very good description of everything, right? Because this is what we will play when someone says, well, what about the Jeffrey Epstein stuff? I'll just be like, all right, clip this part to this part here and then watch that. And now that's the best that we have so far up to date. But two things that I want to go on. I mean, it's clear to most people, I would say now, or this has sped this up. The fact of the matter is that we feel as if power is seated in our government, in our elected officials.
Mhm.
And I would say more so ever, at least in my lifetime, I feel as if people are becoming more aware that there are more power players controlling things within your government, and not necessarily with your government, but with your daily lives, whether that's
Right.
in the private world or not. And that, I think, is something that people need to be privy to if they want to have a good understanding of the worldview and also of your government. Because if you're not counting on that, it's not to say that clearly we're not stating that elected officials have no power, or that the seat of power isn't necessarily that they're detached from it. I don't believe that at all. But the fact that you don't know who else is making a decision, and whether or not it's in the best interest for the state, for the people, that I think is a massive mystery, along with the part that we don't know at all where his money comes from. But it's clear that I shouldn't say it's clear. It appears that there's also some blackmailing. It's clear that he can manipulate. Those
Right.
things.
It is, except that the tapes. There was always
Oh,
talk
that's
about the
exactly what I was
tape.
going to say.
There was,
Where are they?
well, that's a great question. On my podcast, there's one source who speculates that the Israelis have them, but I deliberately in the podcast, because there's so many conspiracy theories around this man, I
Sure.
deliberately try to show listeners, be very clear with them. Here is this source, and he might be believed for this reason, but he might be disbelieved for another reason, and try and let listeners make up their own mind. The same with the Discovery Plus documentary. I very much try to be very clear with viewers. They should decide whether or not to trust the source. But one of the things that was really striking sitting in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial was that when the FBI raided Jeffrey Epstein's house, they had a search warrant. So they went in and they took pictures of, they got into his safe, they found all these DVDs, and again, they took pictures of it. What was really extraordinary was that instead of then removing it, they then had to leave the premises and go and get a different kind of warrant to then take the stuff out. In the meantime, and I'm going to think, I think it may have been as long as 3 days. They returned to the house and all that stuff is gone.
It's gone.
And now they then phone, Jeffrey Epstein meanwhile is in jail, but they then phone Jeffrey Epstein's, I don't think it was his lawyer. They either phoned the lawyer or the executors, his accountant or lawyer. And they said, oh yeah, we took it. No problem. We'll now come and bring it back. Well, the FBI agent testifying said, yeah, no, it all seemed to be exactly what we'd photographed. Seemed to be.
Okay.
I mean,
yeah, that's not good enough.
So there's always been this talk of tapes, and where are they is a great question.
That's just not good enough to me. I saw some documentary also, and I've yet to watch yours, which of course will. This is going to make it more personal for me, but they just kind of skipped over it, and I understand that because there's clearly not a good answer to that. But it's too clear that we could have some answers for who's on these tapes, who is being manipulated, if there is something there. I mean, we've got a giant mystery that seems like a few key elements of it would actually just solve it. If we could just, where's this money come from? Did you just pay him $160 million because you got blackmailed?
So let me explain the other thing, though, Will, that is sort of, in a way, even is more interesting than the idea of blackmail. And I'm sure that, I would be amazed if Jeffrey Epstein didn't blackmail people, just from what I know of his own dealings with me. I mean, not that he didn't blackmail me, but he was a bully and he was manipulative and he was awful to deal with. But when I was reporting on him in 2002, I went to a jail outside of Boston in Massachusetts, and I met with a guy called Steve Hoffenberg, who was Jeffrey Epstein's former business partner. Hoffenberg at the time was in jail for 20 years. That was his sentence for committing the biggest Ponzi scheme in American history prior to Bernie Madoff. It was for $450 million. Now, what Hoffenberg told me was that Jeffrey was the mastermind of this entire Ponzi scheme, but that because Hoffenberg had pled guilty, it meant that Jeffrey Epstein never got, never had to be deposed or put in front of a jury, because they never had to go through a trial, which would have meant they would have had to have got discovery. What he said was that Jeffrey was the greatest con artist of all time, and that he came up, he had a scheme. He basically fleeced all of his clients by what he called playing the box. Playing the box meant that he essentially covered all his bases. But what Hoffenberg said to me is that Jeffrey would tell his clients, for example, I think you should buy X home in the Virgin Islands or in the Caribbean, and that Jeffrey would deliberately inflate the value of whatever that property or asset actually was and just take half the money. And the guy would then never be wiser, the guy or woman. I did, in my reporting, come across wealthy women whose relatives felt that he had absolutely ruined them. And what Jeffrey Epstein relied on was the fact that rich people, when they've been robbed, and he himself told me this, when a rich person's been robbed, they don't want to go to the authorities. They just want their money back. And he realized that social embarrassment, which sounds sort of stupid to me, maybe to you, but it's a very useful, very useful way of controlling people with money. They don't want to look stupid. So that's why this story is complicated. It's much more complicated than people think. And I think, everyone talks about the girls all the time. Other than Jeffrey Epstein, there aren't, I don't believe, many men who would really want to have sexual relations with a minor, as opposed to having sexual relations with somebody who is not a minor. I mean, exactly. Jeffrey Epstein was clearly, mentally ill. But I don't know. I mean, now, is it possible that he had got men? He didn't tell people what the age was. But when you're dealing with politicians, these people, you would think they would be careful about that stuff. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, it opens up, and I'm a voracious reader, I guess you could say, as well. And the subject is incredibly interesting to me, just because when you grow up in pre 9/11 days and it's all USA is the best and we are this and the saviors of this, and obviously as a really young guy you don't look too deep into that, and everything has changed now with the internet and with stories like this and people like you that are willing to ask these kind of questions. But before I do have one other question. I'm curious, what were the circumstances regarding you even having to talk to Jeffrey in 2002 back in the day, and Ghislaine? It was just because you guys were writing an article? Because I did read the transcripts, like I said, and they are fascinating. We'll link to them down below. But what led to that?
So I was pregnant with twins, so it was a complicated high-risk pregnancy, which meant I couldn't do too much traveling. And Jeffrey Epstein's name very unusually popped up in the press. He wasn't somebody who was ever written about normally, but he had flown Bill Clinton to Africa on some charitable mission. And so my boss at the time said to me, Jeffrey Epstein lives in New York. You live in New York. I've always wondered how he made his money go. This should be easy for you, because I write a lot about money. And what I didn't realize, I did already know Ghislaine Maxwell not well. I knew her. She grew up in England, as did I. She's about 8 years older than me. She went to Oxford. I went to Cambridge. So there was a certain amount. She was somebody who would very occasionally show up at sort of a big party, breeze in, and she, I never knew what she actually did. She just seemed to have a very exotic life that involved a lot of travel. And she name dropped a lot of very important people's names. And, she seemed to be very, very glamorous. She never brought Jeffrey Epstein anywhere with her. So I didn't realize until I was already into my reporting that there was a connection between them. And what I kept being told was that she was in love with him, but he wasn't in love with her, and no one could quite understand why she stuck around with him, because he didn't treat her very well. And that he did have an obsession for young sort of models, but again, I found one underage person, and that was Annie Farmer. I didn't find, what I didn't get, and more is the pity, what we now know, were the reams of underage girls that were coming to give him massages. That people didn't know that, or if they did, they didn't tell me that back in 2002. But I got to Annie Farmer and her older sister Maria Farmer, who felt that, said that he'd been sexually inappropriate with her, he'd sexually abused her, and on top of that, I got to Steve Hoffenberg, who had a great deal to say about Jeffrey Epstein's criminal financial doings, and pointed me to the direction of very critical depositions that there was one that Epstein had given to the SEC. There was another one that Epstein gave in a private dispute. And the more that Jeffrey Epstein realized or began to suspect that I was unearthing things about him that he wouldn't like, the more threatening he became. And, this speaks to his cleverness. I'm a pretty dogged reporter. I'm pretty tenacious. But my one vulnerability at that time was that I was pregnant. And so what he started to do was talk to me in a very inappropriate way about my pregnancy, discussed my vaginal canal, which I really didn't need to hear. But he would threaten he would say, I'm going to have a witch doctor place a hex on your unborn children. And he wanted to know where I was giving birth. He told me he knew all the doctors. So the implication was he would find me. And he told me he could get my husband fired because he knew my husband's boss. He told me that he was going to sue me personally if he didn't, and basically ruin us. And he became he told me that this was personal. I was like, I'm just doing my job. He said, no, this is personal. This is between you and me. And it became so unpleasant. The lawyers at Vanity Fair told me to tape him because it was so unpleasant. And then when I had to put allegations to Ghislaine Maxwell about the Farmers, Annie Farmer had said that she'd been massaged inappropriately by Ghislaine. And Maria Farmer said that Ghislaine Maxwell had been in the room with her when Jeffrey abused her. That was a very, very, very unpleasant conversation. You've got the transcript, because I knew Ghislaine Maxwell, and she tried to play on that, as you see in the transcript. She says, "Well, Vicky, why would you believe two strangers over me? I'm so important." And there's even a line in there. She said, "Well, you and I are both journalists." And I have to say that I do remember that taking me aback, because I was like, I never remember Ghislaine Maxwell being a journalist. But as you can see from the transcript, that was a very, very, very unpleasant conversation that I had to have with her.
Completely.
And obviously she denied all the allegations.
Everything.
As did Epstein.
Yeah, and it's just, obviously a transcript is a transcript. Yeah, we can't hear your voices necessarily and see the tone and things like that. But it, even on paper, she has a modus operandi of how to handle you in this, and she's just basically going to attack your character. How could you possibly? This is absolutely absurd. This is insane. How? So I should ask then too, because now we have somewhat of a quasi-conclusion on what's going to happen with Ghislaine Maxwell. I've heard many people throwing the mistrial word out there. What's going to happen now?
Well, it does look like it does look like there are grounds.
Sorry,
there are grounds.
What was she convicted of?
So she was convicted 5 out of 6 counts of aiding, sex trafficking being one of them, enticement to travel, enticing minors to travel, and aiding Epstein in sexual abuse. And in all but one of those counts, she was convicted. But it does look like there'll be a mistrial, or there's a very strong possibility of a mistrial. We still have a ways to go. But a lot of the former assistant US attorneys I've spoken to think that they would be shocked if there isn't a mistrial, but we'll see. The stats normally, if there is a new trial, it actually doesn't work in favor of the defendant.
Okay. So she would actually.
I
didn't know.
It might know. According to, this is sort of, this is only anecdotal, but I'm told that that usually when there's a new trial, it doesn't work in favor of the defendant. If anything, it means there's going to be a more stringent verdict.
Yeah.
I mean, that's based on history. We don't know. Well, that's the truth.
Okay. Yeah, of course. Well, I didn't know that a mistrial might mean that that the charges have to be dropped, or
no. A mistrial would mean a mistrial means if they declare it a mistrial, within 75 days they have to start procedure for a new trial.
For a new case.
But what I'm saying is that historically, although this doesn't happen, mixed. It depends often where. Sometimes this is helpful for the person accused, and sometimes it is not.
Sure. Yeah. That's I wanted to touch on just before, because obviously you wrote Kushner Inc., and I know this is a very hard turn left, as we say on this podcast, with everything there, since we can't really have a conclusion, and this is going to be an ongoing saga, I'm sure, for some time now. Probably one of the mysteries of our generation here. I don't know that it's one that's going to be solved at all, and it might just go down in history as one of these JFK-like things. But Kushner Inc., which I haven't even taken a step to dive into, I did recall reading a interesting piece on Jared. Is it correct? Is he Jared, the son?
Yeah.
Is Jared, but his father has quite an interesting background.
To say the least.
Yeah, right. Which I didn't know anything about,
right.
And I know we don't have a whole lot of time to go into it. But I'm just curious what you dove into and what you found, or if you could come up and say, "Wow, this is what really surprised me about all that." What did you get into there?
Well, look, I mean, what the basis of the book is really about is this idea that it certainly appeared, and it continues to appear. By the way, because as we speak, there are reports of Jared Kushner getting billions of dollars for his investment fund from the Saudis. But what the book was really about was the very strong appearance that Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump went into government not for public service, but to help themselves, and that really troublingly, American foreign policy was conducted primarily to save the Kushner family real estate business at great risk to America's security. And I'm referring to the fact there that at one point, I'm trying to remember, I'll make sure I get my years right, I believe it's 2017, the Saudis and the Emiratis, two other countries, announced a blockade of Qatar. And neither the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had any inkling that this was about to happen. And they had just all been in Saudi Arabia for the first American state visit abroad. Jared Kushner was known to be very, very close to the Saudi Crown Prince. And the reason that was so significant is that Qatar is where the US Air Base Al Udeid is. So that is our security I have a British accent, but I'm American. That is our security at risk. And, it's a complicated story. Months go by, and by late spring, American support for the blockade gets dropped right after Trump and the Saudi Crown Prince have had a disagreement about money, how much money the Saudis are going to pay the Americans. But meanwhile, the Qataris come to Washington, offer to help out with the blockade, and basically I explain in the book that two things happen within a very short period of time, which is that one, the US agrees to drop its support of this blockade of Qatar, and at the same time, Brookfield, a company that's biggest outside shareholder is the Qatari investment fund, bails out Charles Kushner's business, which no American investor would touch.
Right.
It was deemed such a disaster. So the optics of that are and were really, really problematic.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, then, yeah, good that we can't solve that in 2 minutes of time speaking. But yeah, we will link to everything obviously down below. You make podcasting very easy. Having journalists on, I must say, I'm going to definitely think about having maybe just only journalists, because you guys have done all the work. And so you guys are telling all these stories and you have all your facts and all the stuff. And so it makes my job very, very, very easy. So no, but is there any place specifically if guys want to check out more on what you have dug into?
So
where should we send them?
my Substack. So, I'm doing a lot. I'm podcasting and I'm making another document. I'm producing another documentary. I'm going to write my next book. But I also streamline it all in my newsletter, which I do twice a week on Substack. It's called Vicky Ward Investigates. So you go to Vicky Ward Investigates at substack.com and you'll see.
All right. Then, guys, we will link all to that. Really quickly, though, you said you were working on something new. Are you able to say what you're working on?
I am. I'm headed down to South Carolina to report on this extraordinary story down there of a family of lawyers who held power over 5 counties for 100 years. And recently, they have been exposed as crooks. And then the patriarch has stolen all this money. But on top of that, his wife and his son have been killed in a brutal homicide. And this all happened in a very rural area, very small population. And it's a huge mystery as to why and who and what is this. It sort of feels like it's probably connected to the abuse of power that's been going on down there. So it's a sort of gothic southern mystery.
Wow. Okay. Well, awesome. We will look out for that. Guys, check out everything. We have linked it down below. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's in the description box. If you're on podcast, you just listen to it. Everything is in the show notes. Vicky, this was awesome. Thanks a ton.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Thanks, Will.
Guys, we'll see you later. Yeah. See ya.
Bye.